Welcome to Live with Living Cities, the podcast where we explore how to build a just and equitable society by dismantling systemic barriers to financial equity. I'm your host, Justin Charles, and in each episode, we dive deep into real-world strategies to close the racial wealth gap, foster economic justice, and uplift historically marginalized communities. Today, we're starting with an introduction to Living Cities, who we are, why we exist, and the critical work we're doing to address systemic racism and the economic inequality in cities across the U.S. Now, we're talking about transformative change, systems change, and why that's the only way to ensure a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. Now, we'll explore the root causes of racial wealth gaps and how Living Cities works to disrupt these systems in cities across the country. And we're not working alone. We're collaborative, powered by some of the world's most influential philanthropies and financial institutions, committed changemakers who partner with us and with city governments to drive long-lasting, transformative change. Now let's start with the big question. Why does this work matter so much?
Even with all the work done over the decades to expand access to economic opportunity and right past wrongs, very little has moved the needle where it matters.
This is Joe Scantlebury, President and CEO of Living Cities.
Living Cities research found that the gap between median net worth for Black families and white families has been essentially unchanged since the 1960s, despite all of the advances from the civil rights movement. The median wealth for a white family is nearly 8 times greater than that of a Black family. This gap comes from the legacy of systemic racism, discrimination, and disinvestment in communities of color. When I started at Living Cities about 3 years ago, we were deep in the middle of a pandemic, with many of us just receiving our final dose of the vaccines. We were beginning to experiment with what life would look like post-pandemic. We were also, of course, still riding the wave of the post-George Floyd moment in our nation's collective reckoning with the ongoing legacy of racism and discrimination in our society. Now, while the pandemic is thankfully far behind us, we are still grappling with how to create an inclusive economy for all. I hate to say it, but I think given the heightened nature of our political discourse, we have a long road to go before we can build an economy that works for all. We are building on the momentum we now have as a collaborative, supporting a multi-sector and multiracial coalition to create an equitable economy, to further catalyze what is happening on the national level and in cities across the country. This requires us to tap into the expertise, insights, and perspectives of the others in this movement and work together strategically. This is where Living Cities comes in. The truth is, fixing these inequities requires more than just surface-level solutions. It demands systems change, fundamental shifts in how cities, governments, and institutions operate. At Living Cities, we seek to tackle the systemic barriers that stand in the way of racial and economic equity. We want to create an inclusive economy for all by closing racial wealth gaps and ensuring that everyone, especially people of color, can access the opportunities, resources, and capital needed to thrive. We have 4 main pillars of our work as a collaborative. We think these are key to building an inclusive economy: demonstrating what works and supporting the scaling of what works. Changing narratives, especially those that conflate race and risk when it comes to investment. Democratizing access to knowledge so that more of us understand what works and what's simply a myth or just misinformation. And then driving aligned action through both our collaborative and the work that our collaborative supports across the country. We're not just addressing symptoms, we're getting to the root of the problem.
Let's talk about Living Cities' history and how we evolved to meet these challenges head-on. Now, back in 1991, Living Cities, then known as the National Community Development Initiative, was founded to improve the lives of low-income people in cities through the construction of affordable housing and neighborhood development in urban areas. The goal was to pool tens of millions of dollars from foundations and financial institutions to support the work of community development corporations. Now, these organizations were at the forefront of producing affordable housing, and helping to stabilize declining neighborhoods. But as we continued this work, it became clear that housing alone wouldn't be enough. You see, the problems were bigger than just housing. They were about economic opportunity, systemic disinvestment, and the exclusion of entire communities from the wealth-building systems that were working for others. In 2007, we made a major pivot, broadening our scope to address economic opportunity in a more holistic way. We understood that poverty wasn't just about the lack of housing, it was about a lack of access to the financial systems, resources, and capital that people need to improve their lives. And in 2012, we made an even more critical shift. We acknowledged that racism is at the root of so many of the challenges we're trying to solve. This was a pivotal moment for Living Cities. We moved away from a race-neutral approach to one that placed racial equity at the center of everything we do. We recognized that you cannot address poverty and economic inequality in America without directly confronting racism. So how do we create this kind of system change? As Joe said, Living Cities works across cities, collaborating with local governments, philanthropists, community organizations, and the private sector to dismantle these deeply embedded barriers to economic opportunity. The problems, they're complex, and they can't be solved by one group alone. That's why we bring together a wide array of partners to create comprehensive solutions that address the root causes of inequity. Now, one of the ways we do this is through one of our most powerful initiatives, the Closing the Gaps Network.
With support from its members and strategic investments from the City Foundation, Living Cities stood up and launched the Closing the Gaps CTG Network in 2020.
This is Julian Coletta, one of our senior associates here at Living Cities.
This strategy was our signature long-term effort to bring together leaders from cities across the country to help them imagine what an anti-racist society might look like and play an important role in building it through transforming government policies, practices, and operations. Since its launch, 24 cities have joined this growing community and have access to cross-city, topic-based learning opportunities, including discussions on community engagement, inclusive procurement, and the use of art and city-led program design. We facilitated these activities and offered tools and resources for implementing anti-racist programs and practices in network cities. 2020 also marks the time when Living Cities embarked on a deep journey of racial equity awareness building with a subset of leaders within the network. This journey, known as the Year of Reckoning, helped city leaders build a deep awareness of the ways in which racially biased policies have impacted Black, Latin, Indigenous, and other residents of color. Living Cities partnered with these cities to understand the local histories that led to the racial wealth gap in their cities and equipped them with the necessary data and expertise to design systemic solutions. The CTG network was launched through this year-long effort. It continues to support the cities of Albuquerque, Austin, Memphis, Minneapolis, Rochester, and St. Paul advance data-driven, equitable wealth-building strategies through home and business ownership.
The Closing the Gaps Network is a powerful example of Living Cities' boots-on-the-ground approach to creating an anti-racist society and supporting cities in transforming their policies, practices, and operations. In future episodes, we'll dive deeper into this work, bringing you first-hand stories and insights from the cities and leaders who are driving these changes. Stay tuned for a closer look at the transformative impact of the CTG network and the progress being made to build equitable wealth through home and business ownership. Next, we're going to talk about one of our newest initiatives, the Center for Wealth Equity, or CWE.
The Center for Wealth Equity is focused on one essential mission: turning knowledge into action to close the racial wealth gap. Despite decades of research, programs, investment, and good intentions, racial wealth inequality in the U.S. has barely budged.
This is Dr. Ahmed Witt, Director of the Center for Wealth Equity here at Living Cities.
The challenge isn't really a lack of information anymore. It's about turning that information into practical, impactful action. And that's where we step in. Our work at the center is about bridging this gap. We synthesize insights from research, from lived experiences, and on-the-ground practices to create practical tools and resources. And these tools are tailored and delivered to capital allocators, policymakers, and community leaders. those who are best positioned to drive real change. For instance, we gather data on what works in supporting home ownership, supporting entrepreneurship, and community investment. And we present it in a way that helps decision makers implement these tested, proven strategies effectively in their respective contexts. Often I get the question of why is this important? And I think making these resources accessible and actionable is what can help lead to increased flow of financial resources to Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latinx-led initiatives. And these are the initiatives that we know often struggle to get the funding they need. We also are looking to create partnerships and working groups to foster more collaboration between these groups, but also cities, private funders, community organizations. We're looking really to amplify the impact and make the most of existing resources. Through our efforts, we're not only raising awareness, but building a system of accountability and collaboration. And this is what's going to help ensure that the knowledge we generate leads to measurable change. Ultimately, we aim to create an inclusive economy by helping those with the power to allocate capital do so in ways that genuinely support wealth equity. If you're listening to this, you're probably a decision maker, even if you don't realize it, for your organization, your community, or maybe just your family. And the Center for Wealth Equity invites you to be part of this change. By collaborating, sharing insights, using our tools, we can all contribute to closing the racial wealth gap and building a more inclusive economic future.
Peace. My name is Norris Williams, Associate Director for Business Ownership. One of Living City's boldest initiatives is the Inclusive Capital Council, or ICC. The ICC is designed to remedy racial disparities and access to capital for business owners from historically marginalized communities. When we say capital, we're talking about the financial resources like loans, investments, and operational funding that businesses need to start, grow, and thrive. Unfortunately, traditional financial systems such as banks, credit unions, and other conventional lenders often create barriers for these business owners. These systems tend to rely on rigid credit requirements and outdated risk assessment methods, which disproportionately exclude historically marginalized communities. This work is vital because equitable access to capital is essential for creating thriving local economies, closing wealth gaps, and building generational wealth. For too long, entrepreneurs from historically marginalized communities have been shut out of opportunities to grow their businesses, support their families, and invest in their neighborhoods. By addressing these inequities, the ICC aims to strengthen these entrepreneurs to reach their full potential and contribute to a more inclusive and prosperous economy for everyone. To achieve this, the ICC brings together capital decision makers from government, financial institutions, philanthropy, and community-based capital allocators, or what we've coined as CBCAs. Together, the ICC is working to shift more financial resources into the hands of these CBCAs, led by members of historically marginalized communities, ultimately complementing their power to better support entrepreneurs. Continuing over a decade of Living Cities experience in wealth building, the ICC focuses on fostering collaboration and innovation to drive economic growth. Its efforts include creating new standards for financial risk assessment, designing financial products tailored for these entrepreneurs, advocating for policies that level the playing field, and amplifying the critical role of CBCAs in this economy. So what's our ultimate goal? Unlocking more funding for businesses in historically marginalized communities, supporting diverse leaders to take charge of deciding how financial resources are distributed, and ultimately helping to create an economy where everyone has the opportunity to succeed.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Live with Living Cities. We're thrilled to have you as part of these essential conversations about building a just and equitable society. Your time, curiosity, and commitment to change mean a lot. And we can't wait to have you back for our next episode, where we'll dive even deeper into the work of dismantling systemic barriers to equity. The work of Living Cities is driven by the belief that we can close the racial, income, and wealth gaps. But to get there, we need you, our listeners, to be part of the movement. Whether you're a philanthropist, a social impact leader, a community organizer, or simply someone who believes in justice, there's a role for you to play. So, how can you get involved? Start by visiting livingcities.org to learn more about our programs and the cities we're working with. You can subscribe to this podcast to hear more stories from the front lines of change. And please share this episode with others who care about closing the racial wealth gap and building a more equitable future for all. Here's Joe Scantlebury.
Living Cities is a member collaborative. We exist because our members have resolved that they can do better together and that they're committed to long-term solutions versus short-term programmatic projects that do great work and have great outcomes, but ultimately don't drive systems change. We're dealing with long-term issues, and we have members who see this in a very serious way. They are unusual partners, foundations, and financial institutions, but they're partners who understand that the solutions that we seek are not simply philanthropic solutions. These are solutions that require both government, the private sector, the investment sector, and philanthropy to come together to craft solutions for the entire nation. We do not exist without the commitment of our members.
We'd also love to hear from organizations interested in becoming members of Living Cities. If your organization would like to join our coalition of changemakers, reach out to us at lcinfo, that's LCINFO, at livingcities.org with the subject line, Member. Together, we can build systems that work for everyone, and this work isn't going to be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But with the collective power of changemakers across the country, we can transform cities and lives. And before we wrap up, we want to extend a huge thank you to the incredible organizations that make this work possible. Living Cities is powered by a coalition of leaders and changemakers whose dedication and support drive our mission forward. So special thank you to the Annie E. Casey Foundation, Cerna Foundation, Truist Foundation, Citi Foundation, Deutsche Bank, the Gates Foundation, McKnight Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, the JPB Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the M&T Charitable Foundation, the Prudential Foundation, Melville Charitable Trust, MetLife Foundation, Morgan Stanley, W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, and the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation. We're honored to work alongside you in the movement to close the racial wealth gap and create lasting impact in communities across the country. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in. Until next time, stay engaged, stay inspired, and let's keep working together toward a future where equity is a reality for all. I'm Justin Charles, and this has been Live with Living Cities.